These allegations before the court today are incredibly disturbing, and it's alleged that the minor child was, quite frankly, living in a house of horrors.
A 14-year-old girl weighing just 35 pounds, found barely alive inside what police call a house of horrors in Wisconsin, is the story we're talking about. We are learning shocking new details about the alleged years of starvation, confinement, and cruelty that authorities say nearly killed this girl. 3 adults are now facing felony neglect charges, and a possible 4th person could be charged as well. We are going to break it all down with a former prosecutor right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Real quick, you know why we can cover a story like this in depth? It's because of our sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. I'm talking America's largest personal injury law firm. I'm talking a firm with over 1,000 attorneys who have recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. In fact, in the past few months alone, a client in Florida received $12 million when insurance offered just $350,000. In Pennsylvania, another client was awarded $26 million. That is 40 times the insurer's offer. And Morgan & Morgan, they make it easy to fight for what you deserve. You can even start a claim from your phone. So if you're injured, you can start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. You can click the link below, or you can scan the QR code on screen. We are following a case out of Wisconsin that is so disturbing that a prosecutor involved is calling this the most egregious case of child neglect she has ever seen. A 14-year-old girl, 14, on the brink of death, weighing just 35 pounds. That is what police say they found in a home in Oneida, leading to shocking child neglect charges against her own father, Walter Goodman, and 2 other adults. And now, police are saying a possible 4th suspect may soon face charges. This situation was so dire that the court commissioner described the home not as a house, but as something far worse.
These allegations before the court today are incredibly disturbing, and it's alleged that the minor child was, quite frankly, living in a house of horrors.
And within that supposed house of horrors, the criminal complaint reveals a detail that is just bone-chilling. It wasn't just the allegations of starvation or that she was locked in her room. It was her reaction to food in the hospital that makes this just incredibly heartbreaking. According to the complaint, when a nurse explained to this girl that she would get 3 meals a day and, a whole list of food she could finally eat, her eyes lit up. And then, authorities say, she said this: "My dad will be so mad, he doesn't like when I eat this much." Let's rewind. Let's talk about it. Let's walk through exactly how this situation unfolded, because the details are incredibly staggering and disturbing. But this all started back in the spring of 2020 when a young girl, we're going to be calling her MJG to protect her identity, moved in with her biological father, Walter Goodman, in this trailer, and she's about 9 years old at the time. She is joining a household that includes Walter's wife, Melissa, Melissa's daughter, Savanna LeFever, and her 15-year-old son, and Savannah's partner, Kayla Stemler. Now, according to the criminal complaint, things began to change dramatically after Kayla moved into that home in August of 2021. That is when MJG's world seems to have shrunk down to the size of a single room. Police say she was forced to live almost exclusively in her bedroom, which was monitored by a camera that her father had installed. And this wasn't just a precaution. Investigators allege that her door was locked from the outside with a barrel bolt. They even found the lock and noted the screw holes matched up perfectly with the door and frame. And for years, investigators claim this was her life. Police and child welfare officials say that she was let out only a few times a day under strict supervision, often just to use the bathroom. And when the adults in the house would leave, they would allegedly leave MJG locked in that room in the care of others. So I want to talk about that condition. I want to talk about her condition. Over the years, investigators claim that she became severely, horrifically thin. In fact, an officer observed how she appeared to be 6 to 8 years old. That's what they thought. But she wasn't a young child. She was a teenager, and her body was literally shutting down from an apparent lack of food. That's the allegation. This all came to a head on August 21st of this year. That is when Walter Goodman finally called 911. And on that call, which is included in the complaint, he apparently tells the dispatcher that his daughter is, quote, lethargic, like she's comatose, and that her eyes are open, but, quote, creepy. He mentions that she's grinding her teeth and stiffening up in his arms. And when first responders arrived, they said that she was so emaciated, Her collarbones, her ribs, her hip bones, they were poking through her skin. Her blood sugar was at a life-threatening low level of 24. She was rushed to the hospital, then flown to Children's Wisconsin, where she was immediately intubated. And a prosecutor said she was, and I quote this, very, very close to death. She weighed, again, just 35 pounds. You know, a typical 14-year-old girl weighs more than, triple that? She was diagnosed with severe malnutrition. It had caused multiple organ failures. Her liver, her pancreas, her heart, they were all affected. She had osteoporosis like an elderly person. She had pressure sores from lying on the floor. This is all in the report. This is all alleged in the reports. This week, these 3 adults arrested in this case, Walter Goodman, Savanna LeFever, Kayla Stemler, they faced a judge, and the charges are severe. We're talking multiple felony counts of chronic neglect of a child. Consequence is great bodily harm. So the question is, what exactly did police uncover in this investigation? What was said in that courtroom? I want to dive into all of this, and I want to bring back onto the show, friend of the show, practice professor of law, former child abuse and sex crimes prosecutor, Marian Braccia. Thank you so much for taking the time. Before I even get your perspective, your reaction to all of this, let me just play something real quick, okay? This week, these 3 adults at the center of this case faced a judge for the first time. Walter Goodman, Savanna LeFever, Kayla Stemler, they're each facing 5 felony counts of chronic neglect of a child. And the charges specify that the consequence was great bodily harm and emotional damage. Goodman, so the girl's father, being held on a $150,000 cash bond. LeFever, the stepsister, also being held on a $150,000 cash bond. Stemler, LeFever's partner, lower bond, still significant, $100,000 cash. In that courtroom, okay, the prosecutor and the court commissioner, they laid out just the gravity of this situation. In fact, here's some of what was said per Fox 11 News.
These allegations before the court today are incredibly disturbing, and it's alleged that the minor child was, quite frankly, living in a house of horrors.
The last time she saw a medical provider was approximately 5 years before this incident came to light. She was very, very close to death. Again, 39 pounds or 35 pounds at 14 years old. This is the most egregious case of child neglect I think I have ever personally seen in my nearly 25-year career.
Professor, that's a statement. That's a statement to make, right? The worst case of child neglect they've seen in 25 years. I mean, from your perspective, what do you take away from this? Because for me, if the allegations are true, it's the amount of time, the prolonged episodes, the blatant allegations here, that's the part that stands out to me.
Yeah, and the fact that a tenured veteran prosecutor would say that this is one of, if not the worst case of child neglect that she's ever seen, I think is very telling. Prosecutors, all advocates, are trained to not be hyperbolic in their language, to not exaggerate just for the sake of effect. And so for this prosecutor to have measured this case against all the others that they've prosecuted, that is a very telling distinction between her body of work and what we're considering here.
Before we go any further into this, if these allegations are true, does it shock you that this was going on, allegedly going on, for such a prolonged period of time and nothing stopped it? No one stepped in? I mean, we'll get a little bit more into the specifics, but you and I cover these cases all the time, and I think that's a fair question to ask.
Yeah, and you know what, Jesse, we've talked about this before. I think that it happens far more often than we'd like to admit, or far more often than we'd like to think about, that children who perhaps are not in the conventional schoolhouse, going through the school day with teachers, with school administrators, with school health personnel, they really are at risk of slipping between the cracks. And when these horrible things are either happening to them or their very basic needs are not being met, that is not something that is on our societal radar, and it really should be.
So to truly understand the severity of this case, we got to do a deep dive into the criminal complaint. And the details that are documented by investigators, they are extensive. They paint a picture of alleged systemic and prolonged abuse. Okay, I want to start with the conditions inside of that home. According to the complaint, MJG's life was one of almost total confinement. The complaint states, quote, when both Walker and Melissa, again the wife, would both leave the house at the same time, Savannah and Kayla would be left responsible for MJG's care. And investigators even discovered that there was a barrel bolt lock being used to lock the door. Now, you, Professor, we were talking about it right before we came on. From a legal standpoint, you have multiple adults that are accused of, participating in this, maybe this confinement, this neglect. But I do wonder if they're varying roles. I do wonder if you have multiple people being charged essentially with the same crime. Does that complicate it for prosecutors or strengthen their case?
Well, I think that it really goes to show what the arrangement was and what the agreement was between the adults in this household. It wasn't that the stepdaughter was being left unaware in the care of, or excuse me, in supervision of this child who had special needs. If there was an arrangement, even as casual or informal as it can be, something like, will you keep an eye on her while I run to the store? If the stepdaughter and her partner assumed that responsibility or acquiesced to that responsibility, then they were in charge of her care and well-being and her safety. And for them to have neglected it, I think the prosecutor will argue goes to prove one of the elements of the charges they're facing. Do you see one blaming the other? Absolutely. Yeah. I think that it is predictable that if the stepmother, if Melissa is charged, that she will in all likelihood blame the father or point a finger at the father. I think certainly the stepdaughter and her partner will say, we had no parental responsibility. We had no caretaking role in this child's life. So we had no idea what her condition was or what needed to be done for her. Of course, I'm sure we'll discuss there's ample electronic evidence that will likely be used to dispute that. Oh, yeah. But yes, I can foresee a situation where there's lots of finger pointing at each other. By the way, these charges, these felony counts of chronic neglect of a child, you have the added language of great bodily harm, emotional damage, they feel quite broad. They feel like they can encompass a range of conduct here, as opposed to other kind of charges we see in cases like this. Can you explain what prosecutors would need to prove here? Is this am I right, it's kind of a broader charge that can encompass a lot and maybe easier for prosecutors to secure a conviction? Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is very broad language. And I think that was intentionally designed by the state legislature. There's certainly public policy reasons behind wanting to protect children and making the neglect of children as broad an offense as possible to serve as either a deterrent or to give prosecutors greater leeway to prosecute with various types of evidence. I think in this case, the mere medical evidence, physical condition of this child will go to support the elements of the great bodily harm charge. And I think in all likelihood, they would need the testimony of the hospital personnel and perhaps social service personnel and first responders to describe the emotional responses and the aspects of the child when she was discovered and when she was being cared for in the hospital. I think that will likely go to support some of the emotional harm charges. General question, and I want to be very clear about this, okay? I'm not making excuses. I want to be clear. I'm not making excuses. But what is the legal line between bad parenting and a crime? What do I mean by that? If you have situations where, for example, they didn't take her to a doctor for years, and let's say you have a parent or parents or caregivers who are like, we're just so busy, we didn't have the resources to get her to the doctor, we're doing the best that we can, we're not deliberately not feeding her, maybe we don't have money for food or we can't feed as regularly, we're working these jobs. I'm not saying this case, the allegations are quite egregious, but from a legal point of view, do prosecutors look in and say, they're bad parents, they should have gotten help, they could have gotten help, but I don't think that this rises to a crime necessarily. What is the legal line? Yeah, well, I think every case, it has to be looked at independently, right? There is no cookie cutter case. There is no bright line rule to say, this is what's criminal and this is just what's what's bad parenting, what is perhaps not well prepared for this life of parenthood. So every single case will depend on the totality of circumstances, of course. I think that the state legislature here was also very intentional in drafting the language of the statute, because there is an exception for poverty, right? A failure to meet the needs of this child or to neglect the care of the child for reasons other than poverty. So this state legislature was very conscientious in making sure that parents who, because of a lack of resources, couldn't provide or were struggling to provide for their children wouldn't be or couldn't be prosecuted. In this particular case, I think that and this goes beyond crimes of omission, just, oh, I was too busy to keep up with the well appointments, or I was too busy to attend to, this need on a regular basis. If we're looking at a course of conduct, if we're looking at a period of at least 5 years where a teenager was wasting away to 30-some pounds, that is something that goes beyond the realm of I was just too busy. This is something that any reasonable person in the care of a child would be able to say, something isn't right here. And that kind of breaking, that pause should have happened before, certainly well before a 5-year mark.
Before we get into the text messages, which I think separates this case from other cases, just let me leave it there. High bond, I mean, $150,000, $100,000, your reaction to those?
Again, you're right. It is high bond. I don't know any of the 3 charged defendants' criminal history. I don't know what other contacts they've had with the system. I don't know if they have prior failures to appear in court or failures to, or any prior absconding. Ordinarily, the intention of bail is to ensure a defendant's presence and participation in the proceedings. There is, I think, a philosophy behind bail not being punitive, but there is also the concern for this child's safety. I think that the magistrate who set the bail would have been thinking about this child not being contacted by her caregivers, not being intimidated by her caregivers, not being exposed to further harm by her caregivers. So I think that probably factored into the bail decision, but ultimately bail is to ensure a defendant's presence.
Now, you are the master of evidence, okay? We always talk about evidence here, okay? Text messages can be some of the most damning, incriminating pieces of evidence against defendants, because even though we live in an AI world, the ability to say, I was totally generated, I didn't write this, someone else had, at the end of the day, very, very difficult for a defendant to argue that those text messages weren't sent by their clients. Then the question becomes, what's the context of it? Let's keep that in mind when we talk about context, because you do wonder, does this look, pretty cut and dry? This complaint contains shocking evidence from the family's text messages, or messages, I should say. So in one exchange, Melissa Goodman texts, "Can you please make sure the door is locked, and so is Stupid's, please?" Now, the alleged dehumanization extended even further in a Facebook group chat where Kayla wrote, "Sassy has peed on MJG twice now, LMAO," to which Walter and Melissa reportedly responded, LMAO. And the control, police say, was absolute, down to the most basic necessities. Messages show that water was used as a tool for punishment, with one message stating, "Because last night I took her water away and then he took her to the bathroom and let her drink it." In another, while caring for MJG, Kayla apparently writes, "Just so you know, MJG was taking more than one bite at a time, and when Savannah confronted her, she continued to argue with her, so I used the belt." This is to which Melissa Goodman replied, "That's fine." And Savannah apparently messages, "I'm scared we're all going to go to jail or something. I am just scared because of how horrible she looks." And just to be clear before we go any further, Melissa Goodman, as of now, has not been charged in this case, although that could change very soon. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later. Professor, how devastating is this to their cases?
Well, all of these statements, if they can be attributed to each of these defendants, would be admissible by the prosecution as party admissions. So the prosecution can admit these defendants' statements. They were non-custodial. This isn't something that would be subject to the Miranda warnings that we see on TV, like you have the right to remain silent. These were not responses that were being given to police interrogation. These were private conversations. And so they would be, with proper authentication, they would be admissible against the defendants in the prosecution's case in chief. And that is a really powerful tool for the prosecutor to have, because once we get to trial, as we all know, of course, the constitutional rights are there. The constitutional rights will always and do always protect the defendant. So they have a right to maintain their silence. They have a right to not testify and to incriminate themselves. However, this is a really powerful tool for the prosecutor to be able to admit their words without forcing the defendants to take this stand, which of course would be unconstitutional and not allowed by our system. So these words of the defendants, again, if they can be authenticated, if they can be attributed back to their accounts, to their devices, to their phones, if there can be a more likely than not showing that these communications were made by each of the people who've been charged, this is, as you point out, very damning evidence of their knowledge and their intent to cause this child harm.
And I didn't even get into these messages that you can argue, I would assume, and I'll get your perspective on it, show a conscious effort to, hide her condition, so consciousness of guilt in a way, right? The complaint states that they told this girl's grandmother that she was, quote, on a trip with his cousin. This is when apparently the grandmother asked to see her. And then you have this message where Savannah reportedly writes, I wish she didn't look so awful so she could just go to the doctor and get a feeding tube with that high calorie stuff. Now, the medical findings in the complaint are maybe the most gut-wrenching, and they directly contradict the story that her father, Walter Goodman, initially told police, because they say he claimed that her weight loss was because she, quote, just don't eat. This was due to autism, and that she would stay awake for 1 to 3 weeks at a time, burning all these calories. But the medical report in the complaint states that her presentation was consistent with, quote, severe and prolonged malnutrition, likely years. So not days or weeks, years. And maybe most tellingly, a nurse documented that when told that she would get 3 meals a day, MJG's eyes, quote, lit up as she started listing off all the options of food she could have. And she stated, my dad will be so mad, he doesn't like when I eat this much. Now, Professor, when I look at those messages, and I'm looking at this other evidence, the physical evidence that's been presented, the alleged statements from the victim here, the messages are corroborated, are supported by everything else.
And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said consciousness of guilt. I mean, how many times can there be an expression of fear or an expression of apprehension? I don't want to take her to the doctor. I don't want other family members to see her. That shows their knowledge, or the prosecutors will argue that that is proof of their knowledge of their wrongdoing. And there are specific jury instructions related to that the fact finder can take into consideration their actions attendant to their actual commission. They can take into consideration things they were doing under the circumstances to hide her condition and to hide whatever involvement they had in bringing her to that circumstance.
Does she have to testify? Does MJG, prosecutors need her to testify? Would they require her to testify? How does that work exactly?
I cannot imagine a world in which this child would be called to testify. Not only would there be competency challenges if she is on the autism spectrum, if she isn't, and that's certainly not to say that anyone with ASD is an incompetent witness. That is not at all what I'm saying. There is evidence that there were periods of nonverbality, that she was nonverbal, at least for periods of time. But I think the prosecutors would be cognizant of the fact that putting this child in the spotlight on the stand in front of the people who so abused and neglected her would compound the trauma of what she's already experienced. And looking at this case objectively, I think that there is likely sufficient evidence to proceed with observations of, again, the first responders, the hospital staff, the medical records to show her condition, the text messages to show the communication between the defendants. I cannot imagine a circumstance where this child's testimony would be necessary to meeting the elements of the crimes charged.
Now, we've mentioned Melissa Goodman several times here, and she's Walter's wife. She was present in the home throughout this entire alleged ordeal, and while we've heard her voice, read it in those messages, she has until now been the one adult in that house who's not facing criminal charges, although I will tell you, reportedly that's about to change. According to a report from Fox 11 News, the local police chief has now confirmed that charges are expected against this fourth suspect, Melissa. She's currently in custody. At the time of this recording, though, we don't have any information from a docket showing any charges, but essentially this means that all four adults who lived in that trailer, Walter Goodman, his wife Melissa, the daughter Savannah, Savannah's partner Kayla, they are expected to face justice, according to these prosecutors, and if these allegations are true. Now, Professor, back to you. What does it signify that prosecutors may be moving forward to now charge the fourth suspect here?
I think it shows that they are proceeding on everyone that could have had a hand in this child's horrible neglect and abuse. And I don't think that they are leaving anything to chance, risking any of these defendants testifying on behalf of any of the others. I think that once Melissa Goodman is charged, there are certainly some considerations for marital privilege that will come into play, whether or not the father and stepmother can take the stand and testify against each other. There is another evidentiary quandary there, but I don't think that prosecutors are interested in leaving any T's uncrossed or I's undotted. I think anyone in that house who prosecutors are alleging was responsible for MJG's care and then neglected that care is going to be called to justice.
Yeah, what a case. Professor Marian Braccia, thank you so much for taking the time. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. You can follow me on X or Instagram. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.